But over the last 3 years, the tide has turned. We broke the Taliban's momentum. We've built strong Afghan security forces. We devastated al-Qaeda's leadership, taking out over 20 of their top 30 leaders. Still, there will be difficult days ahead. The enormous sacrifices of our men and women are not over.
That was President Obama's address to Afghanistan on Tuesday evening, where he underscored his message that the tide of the war is receding in Afghanistan. But on that very day, a stark reminder when a suicide bombing in Kabul killed 7 people and showed that security in Afghanistan will continue to ebb and flow no matter what the stated timeline. In the months ahead, as the drawdown nears, time will tell how the president's record in Afghanistan bears fruit on Election Day. But with us now to assess the U.S.-Afghan agreement struck this week is retired General Wesley Clark, former NATO commander and now advisor to President Obama's campaign. He's in Little Rock, Arkansas. Also, Spencer Ackerman, who writes for Wired Magazine's Danger Room blog. He joins us from Washington, D.C. Thank you to both of you for being here. General Clark, I actually want to start with you this morning. We've been talking about President Obama's accomplishments, both in drawing down troops in Iraq, his language in Afghanistan this week, obviously the killing of Osama bin Laden. What kind of difference is that going to make for the president politically in this year?
I think it's a very, very strong platform to take foreign policy off the table as a traditional Republican advantage. It's really the first election since the 1970s where a Democratic president or nominee can actually say we're stronger on foreign policy. And as you said previously, Melissa, in every Democratic, Republican primary debate, there were one or more candidates up there saying that the president was appeasing and weak and repeating a lot of old stuff that's just not true. And I think that the president has to hammer home this message now, take this issue off the table. He is a strong leader. No one's going to get to the right of him or be tougher or more constructive on foreign policy than President Barack Obama has been.
So let me go to you then, Spencer, on this, because this is a very interesting way that General Clark just put it, kind of taking it off the table by making clear the president's strength. And yet I wonder about this idea of taking these issues off the table in an election year. As you look at the actual policy, for example, in this agreement that was signed this week, what is your assessment of the plan itself? Is it something we ought to be talking about as a matter of the 2012 election cycle?
It seems absolutely, Melissa, like it should be something that not only the public should be talking about, but the Obama campaign wants to talk about. I'm not sure they want to take the issue off the table. I think they want to keep it on the table, precisely because it's not very clear what Mitt Romney's Afghanistan policy is. It's not very clear what other avenue of attack, aside from the threshold issue of who's weak and who isn't, the Romney campaign really wants to launch on foreign policy. On the issue itself in Afghanistan, the president talks about a tide of war receding, but tides kind of come in and out and in different levels. And when you look at what's going on in Afghanistan, there's going to be 2 more years of American combat and then 10 more years of a commitment to Afghanistan and a drone war occurring with a lot less visibility next door in Pakistan. So the war is still very much a fact of American life going forward. Yeah,
good. I want to pause that. General Clark, I actually want to ask you a little bit about exactly that drone war question, because I think part of what we want to do here is provide sort of a little more useful information for our viewers about why Afghanistan matters. Certainly part of it is the response to 9/11, the al-Qaeda question. But this week, John Brennan, assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, was talking also about the question of drone attacks, which in Pakistan, for which Afghanistan is obviously critically strategic. So let's take a listen to Brennan.
So let me say it as simply as I can. Yes, in full accordance with the law, and in order to prevent terrorist attacks on the United States and to save American lives, the United States government conducts targeted strikes against specific al-Qaeda terrorists, sometimes using remotely piloted aircraft, often referred to publicly as drones. And I'm here today because President Obama has instructed us to be more open with the American people about these efforts.
Okay, General Clark, it's as straightforward as you can imagine. There is the president's spokesman saying we're using drones here, saying that the president instructed him to tell the American people about that. Is this going to will drone attacks become an issue in the context of the campaign?
I don't think so. I think there are more indications of the strength of President Barack Obama's foreign policy and defense policy. And Melissa, just to be clear, when I say take it off the table, I don't mean the president's going to take and not use it. I mean the Republicans can't use it against him.
Right.
They have no foreign policy positions other than to say Democrats are traditionally weak. He's not weak.
Right.
So now let's get on the Republican failures in the domestic side. And I think that's where the campaign will go, based on a very strong platform in foreign policy, the drone attacks being part of this. He hasn't been afraid to use a very powerful weapon, and thank goodness he has, because, as he said, 20 of the top 30 leaders have been taken out. We got Osama bin Laden. We're using drones elsewhere, or unmanned aerial vehicles elsewhere. It's very effective. This is an exceptional problem facing the United States of America. No other nation has ever faced this kind of worldwide attack against us in countries that we're not at war with. And so it requires exceptional means to go back at them. And one of those exceptional means are these unmanned aerial vehicles.
Spencer, I want to ask you about that, because it does feel like this is in part sort of like 21st century war, and that part of the conversation about Democrats being weak on issues of foreign policy is the sort of 20th century version, where you go invade a country and it is states that fight against each other. What should we be thinking about as we're trying to make our audience less blind on these issues? What are the key elements of the new forms of international engagement that are key for us to understand as a public, so that we can judge the quality of our foreign policy?
First of all, it might not be the greatest idea to think of and describe drones as some kind of crazy, exotic robot war, for instance. Every time a drone fires its weapon, a human being decides not just to release the weapon, but where it ought to go, and that there's a chain of intelligence that leads at the end of that cycle to the attack. What is exceptional in this context is that we know nearly nothing about what that targeting cycle is. We don't know what the decisions are that go into deciding who ought to be targeted. Brennan's speech that you played the excerpt from is a classic example of telling and not showing. Among the people that the drones have killed is an American citizen, propagandist for al-Qaeda named Anwar al-Awlaki, that the administration insists, without disclosing any evidence, was an operational member of al-Qaeda. And he was killed, an American citizen. That's something worth having a debate about.
Thank you. Spencer Ackerman, I appreciate it. It's useful for us to continue to think around these questions. I hope you'll come back and join us again. The rest of you are all going to stick around, because we're going to talk more about this question of the strength of leadership. We're also going to talk about it in the context of how we put foreign policy and this new unemployment rate, which dropped from 8.2 to 8.1, and whether or not that actually is going to matter in this year. That's up next.